The Industrial Revolution of the 19th century and the accompanying Land Enclosure Acts forced a large percentage of the population away from the agrarian lifestyle into the newly created cities. Over a similar period of time, we see the development of germ theory and modern methods of sanitation. What this meant was that women in cities would often now find themselves with spare time. Fertility rates were dropping as childhood mortality rates improved, and in an industrial economy, the option of doing work at home simply doesn't exist. Cities also brought people closer together, allowing people to organise with like-minded individuals. It was in this context that the first wave of feminists started campaigning on women's issues and quickly achieved some successes. In 1839, the UK Parliament passed the Custody of Infants Act that allowed women to petition the court for custody of children up to the age of 7. Whilst it should be noted this only gave women the right to petition the court, it is seen as the start of the tender years doctrine that evolves through subsequent case law to give a presumption of maternal custody for children under the age of 7. However, whilst the custody arrangements were changing so that women gained the privilege, the obligations for children remained the same. Men lost the right to the custody of their children, but kept the financial obligation to support those children, a position that has essentially remained unchanged since then. In 1848, at Seneca Falls, New York, the first Women's Rights Convention was held. The crowning achievement of this convention was the Declaration of Sentiments, which essentially established the principles of feminism that have persisted ever since. In its opening statement, we see the rewriting of history as the oppression of women. I quote, "The history of mankind is a history of repeated injuries and usurpation on the part of men towards women, having in direct object the establishment of absolute tyranny over her. To prove this, let the facts be submitted to a candid world." It then goes on to list the sentiments. I won't go through these sentiments individually, you can see them listed here. What is worth pointing out is that many of them are legitimate complaints. However, what is also striking is how they are phrased. Every line starts with the term he and is clearly stating that this is some horror that men have done women, rather than taking a gender-neutral position of saying that society has these faults. This is to blame all men for everything that women felt was unfair in society. However, what is also missing from this document is any recognition of the oppressions that were imposed on men. For example, military service, financial liabilities, and dangerous and unpleasant working environments. Also in the 19th century, we see the Married Women's Property Acts of 1870 and 1882, which granted women rights to property whilst doing nothing to mitigate men's financial obligations to their wives. The other major campaign in the UK at this time was for the repeal of the Contagious Diseases Acts. These acts allowed the police to arrest prostitutes and force them to be tested and treated for venereal diseases. If they refused to submit to this, they could be sent to jail and forced to do hard labour. Or as the Ladies' National Association for the Repeal of Contagious Diseases Acts put it, the act should be repealed because it is unfair to punish the sex who are the victims of a vice and leave unpunished the sex who are the main cause, both of the vice and its dreaded consequences. And we consider that liability to arrest, forced medical treatment, and where this is resisted, imprisonment with hard labour, to which these acts subject women, are the punishment of the most degrading kind. Or in other words, it is okay to punish men for their part in prostitution, but it is not acceptable to punish women, a position that is surely as sexist as the laws that only punish the prostitutes. And so we arrive at the start of the 20th century, when the campaign for women's suffrage became the central focus of the now well-established women's rights movement, and what is usually referred to as the first wave of feminism. One fact that often gets forgotten was that at the time of the suffragettes, a lot of men didn't have the vote. Male suffrage had increased significantly in the 19th century, and in 1884 the Representation of the People's Act extended suffrage to the majority of men. However, suffrage was tied to property, and 40% of men still didn't have the right to vote, which remained true until after the First World War. There were universal suffrage movements during this period, but the ladies of the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies chose to ignore them and instead campaign purely for women's suffrage. These women's movements were not universally supported by all women at the time, and I can't put it better than Mrs. Frances Scott, who in 1910 wrote the following in response to an article by Mrs. Johnson Wood, the feminist lawyer. And yes, there were female lawyers in 1910. For over 30 years, a woman has been able to hold and enjoy her separate property, however acquired, even when it has been given by her husband, freed from any interference or control by him, and from all liability for his debts. A husband is, however, liable for necessities purchased by his wife, and also for money given his wife by a third person to purchase those necessities, and he is bound to support her and her children without regard to her individual or separate estate. Even when a separation occurs, a husband is compelled, through the payment of alimony, to continue to support his wife. Nothing short of infidelity on her part and consequent divorce relieve him of that liability. No obligation, however, to furnish necessities to a husband rests upon the wife under any circumstances whatsoever. A woman may sell, assign, or transfer her real and personal property and carry on any trade or business and perform any labour and service on her separate account, and her earnings are her own sole and separate property. Mrs. Johnston Wood says that the earnings of a husband and a wife belong to the husband, but she forgets to add, out of those joint earnings, the wife must be supported, and that if they are large enough to be invested in real estate, it becomes impossible for a husband to sell or devise it, except subject to her dower right. Through this dower right, Mrs. Johnston Wood complains that a husband is obliged to lease only 1/3 of his real estate to his wife, and that she only has a life interest in it. On the other hand, she can buy, sell, give, or will away her real property as freely as though she were unmarried, without any right of interference by him, and without any claims of his upon it. The dower right is a very real and active line upon a husband's estate, whilst the so-called courtesy right, which is supposed to offset it, is a very shadowy affair, and has been seldom exercised as to make it difficult to find authorities defining its exact limits and privileges. A husband has no right to any of his wife's estate until after the birth of a living child, and this right is so lightly considered that a wife may absolutely defeat it at any time without the consent of her husband, either by conveying her real property during her lifetime or by devising it by will. Should he inherit through courtesy rights, his too is only a life interest. A husband is not obliged to leave his personal property to his wife, but neither is the wife obliged to leave any to her husband. There is no discrimination against, they stand on equality. Mrs. Johnston Wood complains that a woman cannot make a binding contract with her husband to be paid for her services, but she doesn't have to do so. He is obliged to support her, but she can go into any business she pleases, keep all the profits, and still demand support from him. A husband has no claim against his wife's estate for having supported her, but if she supports him, as by keeping a boarding house, and he acknowledges that debt, she has a valid claim for reimbursement against his estate. Generally speaking, the rights of a wife against her husband are such that he cannot deprive her of, while his rights against her depend entirely upon her consent, and she can deprive him of them at any time with the greatest of ease. And so even back at the turn of the 20th century, we see men's rights activists, not least of whom was the Marxist philosopher Ernest Belfort Bax, who wrote several works critical of feminism, most of which is still applicable today, but these campaigners and their criticisms have been largely lost to history. There were also alimony reform movements in the 1910s and 20s, because of the fate of men whose wives left them and who were not able to obtain a divorce. If a man's wife decided she didn't want to live with him anymore and moved out, he would be responsible indefinitely for every single necessity that she had. Even if she had more property than him, he was not entitled to any of that property. she was entitled to his support until the day they divorced. And if it was his fault that they divorced, she was entitled to his support for life or until she got remarried. At this time there were many men who were stuck in the limbo of legal separation, without hope of divorce, and their wives refused to come home. And the feminists of 1910 believed that these same laws were unfair to women. The suffragette movement in Britain stopped campaigning at the onset of the First World War, largely due to Emmeline Pankhurst's insistence that Germany posed a greater threat. In fact, Emmeline Pankhurst and one of her daughters, Christabel, became leading campaigners in the White Feather movement. The Order of the White Feather was started by Admiral Charles Fitzgerald with the aim of shaming men into enlisting in the army by getting women to present any man out of uniform with a white feather, a traditional symbol of cowardice. The campaign proved highly effective and serves as an example of the power women have, and have always had, over men. It should, however, be noted that not all suffragettes supported this campaign. In fact, the Pankhurst family demonstrates the divide, with Emmeline and Christabel joining the campaign, but the other two daughters, Sylvia and Adela, stuck to their pacifist principles and wanted no part of it. Emmeline Pankhurst and the Order of the White Feather also campaigned for the introduction of the draft. The suffragettes who campaigned in this movement clearly saw serving as an obligation that men had. Indeed, in Emmeline Pankhurst's own words, "The least that men can do is that every man of fighting age should prepare himself to redeem his word to women, and to make ready to do his best to save the mothers, the wives, and daughters of Great Britain from outrage too horrible even to think of." This obligation to fight and die is without doubt one of the most onerous of the obligations imposed on either sex, and particularly when it is combined with conscription, it becomes a form of temporary slavery which is highly likely to lead to your death. This obligation is completely ignored by feminists, until, that is, they want men to honour it. What is unclear is what feminists think women are giving in return for this obligation. What is the counterbalancing privilege that men get? In some countries, the obligation to serve was clearly seen as the method by which men purchased their civil rights, specifically the right to vote, but the suffragettes never had any expectation that the draft should be extended to women. It should be noted that this obligation remains true today. Whilst in Britain there has been no conscription since the Second World War, and some women do now serve in the military, nobody would seriously suggest that if the need arose, that women would be conscripted into frontline roles in the same percentages as men. This again shows the feminist movement as one that wants all the rights and privileges that men have, without any of the counterbalancing obligations, and at the same time keeping all the privileges that women have enjoyed throughout time. That is not to say that there aren't true equality feminists, clearly there are, but the movement has always focused on gaining advantages for women, and as such should not be confused with the movement for sexual equality.